Welcome to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures, with thought leader and award-winning author Yvette Bethel. This podcast provides you with insights and ideas you can use to reinvent your culture through trust and the principles of interconnectivity, flow, and balance. At a time when the world is rewriting the rules of work, traditional leadership practices are not enough. It's time to perceive persistent challenges through a new lens. It's time to evolve. Hello, everyone, and welcome once again. This is your host, Yvette Bethel, and the topic for this episode of Evolve is blind spot with coach, speaker, and author Marisa Murray. Marissa brings over 2 decades of success in business and technology leadership roles. Former partner with Accenture and Vice President at Bell Canada, Marissa has built strategy, business transformation, and management skills during her accelerated career path. Marissa's experience spans a diversity of industries and governments. She specializes in helping business leaders enhance their leadership competencies and improve team performance. She offers customized training with professional facilitation and coaching services. Hello, Marissa, and welcome to Evolve.
Thank you so much, Yvette. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Marissa, I'd love to explore some of the premises that you explore in your book, Blind Spot. So before we do that, please tell us a bit about your journey when you wrote the book and what made you write it.
Oh, absolutely. So my journey, I guess maybe as you outlined in my profile, my journey to executive coaching and leadership development was not sort of an instant planned one, I suppose, for lack of a better way of describing it. I was a late bloomer in terms of realizing how important leadership competencies were. I was very focused on kind of an engineering background and doing things and my analytical skills and kind of doing projects with people, but not necessarily realizing how critical those leadership attributes were. So this journey has been one of following my corporate career. And 9 years ago now, I started my company, Leaderly. And the brand is called Leaderly because I think Leaderly is the most beautiful adjective anyone could say about anyone. So I think being leaderly is kind of the highest thing you can be in life. And so when I think about that journey of starting Leaderly and really understanding that pivot point of it's all about leadership. So I kind of went from it's all about getting stuff done, getting results, to it's all about leadership and inspiring and cultivating the incredible collective intelligence of the human species, right? So that shift in my mind was tremendous. And as a result, I just found that I was looking at the world really differently. And my way of trying to understand the world became writing about it, because I was like, how do I organize like what's in my head about all these new ideas? So about 3 years into Leaderly, my practice, I wrote my first book called Work Smart. And that was kind of organizing my thought around this idea of like working hard versus working smart, that classic thing. And what are some of the leadership attributes that I'm working with my clients with the most that are making the difference in terms of their ability to work smart? And that book was absolutely just to figure out what I thought about all these topics. And then my second book is called Iterate. And I wrote that 3 years later, which was during the pandemic, and also just during a time where I realized that although we would like to be really proactive as leaders, we're often very reactive. And sometimes we need this mode of interactive, this word I made up, which is this idea of iterating and kind of just shortening your planning cycle sometimes, because all you can do is respond and attune to what's going on a continuous basis. It's kind of attuned to agile. And I brought together some thoughts around that, around what it means to be an interactive leader and what does it mean to just work every day to iterate by appreciating, aligning, and augmenting the circumstances that you're in. And then 3 years later, which was this past, I began writing the book in 2022, I realized that there were all these blind spot themes that I'd been seeing with my clients. And I wanted to figure them out and give them names and collect the insights. So I found that there were kind of 7 blind spot areas that I was seeing my clients struggle with and ultimately create breakthroughs from identifying and addressing. And so this was once again an opportunity to kind of figure out what I thought about that and write it down. So that's the story around why I write and what I write. And really it's to support my learning and hopefully the learning journey of others.
Quite an interesting journey. Now, Blind Spot explores, as you say, I think there were 7 different blind spots that you came across that seem to be common. Can you give us a brief overview of them, the types of
Yeah,
blind spots?
absolutely. So some of them have, very simple names, simple concepts, but are the things that plague us. So the first one that I talk about is false assumptions. And so many of us will be in a role and we're not getting the kind of results we want and we don't really know why. And a lot of times it comes down to we're holding some kind of false assumption around the way in which we're doing our role or the environment that we're in. So an example of that would be, I like to talk about David, the difference maker. And David is a very, very senior salesperson, phenomenal in terms of his client interaction, phenomenal in terms of his ability to, mobilize the client, make the client, do great large deals with the organization that he's with. And that part of him is absolutely true and relevant. And yet he kind of has this false assumption in his head that being the difference maker means that he has to do everything. And so it's like your brain sort of attaches, some ways of being, but then tucks in this little false assumption. And as a result, he was just getting really overwhelmed. He couldn't scale the team. The organization had grown so much that he wasn't able to, and he was getting really, really burnt out and very grumpy, which was impacting his ability to be the difference maker. And so for me, the breakthrough in false assumptions is just finding that little piece that is plaguing you. And once he was able to see being the difference maker doesn't mean I need to do it all. It can also mean that I can make difference makers out of my team. And he really shifted towards that classic shift of doing it alone versus enabling and empowering the team underneath you. So there's an example of false assumptions, which is the first one. All the blind spots that I cover in the book are quite almost personal. But for sure that classic one around, staying too long in that individual contributor kind of bucket, as opposed to you're the leader of a team, that would be definitely sort of a category of false assumptions that can run in. But, if I just think about another, false assumptions can be really little. Another example in the book that I talk about is Isaac the intellect. And Isaac the intellect runs this false assumption in his mind that, his intellect will win the day. His intellect is his influencing strategy. And it's not true. The quality of the relationships and the way he makes people feel, Isaac had a tendency to kind of intimidate people with his intellect, which created barriers for him to influence people. So, it's interesting, as I'm writing the book, it was less about like kind of, seeing repetitive patterns. It's almost like every individual needs to kind of think about where there's pain, what assumptions am I running about the way I'm doing something? And that's the reflection. There's lots of reflection questions in the book to kind of uncover that, if that helps.
The intellect sounds a lot like experts, and a lot of experts do have that kind of thought process. Like, I just need to know the work. I don't need to know. I don't need to be friends with anyone. And those are some assumptions that they project. So yes, I see your point.
Yeah. Another one that I cover in the book, I called unhealthy detachment. And unhealthy detachment is there's something in your environment that you're kind of detached from. It's not important to you, you're disinterested in it, and yet it's very important to your success or to the people around you. And so an example of that is Gary the Guardian, for instance, I'll give you an example. I give my hero's journey clients these nicknames, but Gary the Guardian, beautiful leader that was very protective of his team. And his team really wanted more exposure, more visibility, more challenge, all this kind of stuff. And so he was coming from a good place of trying to protect them, allow them to focus on the work, not have too many distractions. But every time they asked him for visibility or stretch assignments, all this kind of stuff, he kind of had an unhealthy detachment from it. He kind of had this whole, that doesn't really matter. What really matters is this, and so you're repeatedly being told that something's of value to another person, and you're just kind of detaching yourself from that ask or that need and all that kind of stuff. And as a result, it's demotivating for his team. That's what was causing some of his attrition. That was what was causing some of his team to want to work, in a different environment. And it was kind of repetitive. So sometimes unhealthy detachment is often kind of repetitive feedback that you're just continuously devaluing, and is often a source of the breakthrough. So for Gary, when he started to realize how important that was, he started to get attached to that desire in his employees, and more creative in terms of what he was positioning them from. And everyone was able to elevate as a result of that. So that's another example. It's another blind spot, unhealthy detachments. And there's various forms of that too. It could be unhealthy detachment from an important cultural norm. It could be an unhealthy detachment from, some stakeholder group that really needs your attention, really needs to kind of buy into what's important to them. And that we're kind of we're aware of it, but we're sort of staying too detached.
I guess I don't know if I'm gonna put you on the spot, but I'm gonna ask you
Yeah.
this question. Based on when you look back on your blind spot journey,
Yeah.
what was one of your most valuable lessons or blind spots that you learned about that taught you a lesson?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unhealthy detachments is a great one for me because one of my biggest blind spots that led to me leaving my role as vice president at Bell was that I was detached. I had come from Accenture that was extremely client-centric, sort of had this energy around client centricity that was very, very dominant. And when I moved to Bell, I felt that my team was not client-centric enough. That's all I could see. And they would explain to me a lot of the operational excellence activities that they did. And I would be very detached from that. So they had kind of this, they had kind of we deliver client results through operational excellence. Like that's what and I was like, no, we need to like bend to the client's every whim. Like that was kind of my false assumption and my unhealthy detachments. I had a false assumption around the way to deliver client service, and I had an unhealthy detachment to the fabric of the culture that made that place move, right? That place moved. And so I was really struggling and very unhappy in the culture because I couldn't influence the way I wanted to influence. And so those two combinations of blind spots made me ultimately quit because I wasn't happy, but it was really, when you look back and you're like, could I have been successful? Probably, had I opened myself up to really understand what moved the organization, get behind those things, and orient it's almost like you have this car with this really, really strong engine, and you're not using the engine. You're trying to use your feet like Flintstones in the floor, right? Like, how do you use the power that's already in the culture to get to where you're trying to get? And I think unhealthy detachment for me was the one where I didn't even know that I was ignoring these capabilities. And so that's an example of mine.
It sounds like you actually got a breakthrough after you left, but I know one of your sites that I read, you talk about the connection between blind spots and breakthroughs. Can you tell us more about that and give us an example? Because sometimes people
Yeah.
don't realize that the blind spot is at play.
Absolutely. I mean, so I define blind spots in the book as the gap between intention and impact. So if you
Mm,
think about, we all go to work with our intention to do this great work, and then we have an impact. And the impact, if there's a gap between our intention and our impact, which there often is,
hmm
then there's usually a blind spot at play. And if you can find a way to figure out, why is it what I'm trying to do being received so differently than what I, by others effectively? Why is my impact out of sync with this intention? And what I find is, as soon as you start to get really curious about all the feedback about your impact on others, like what is motivating one, what is demotivating them, what is moving them, what is making them resistant, all those kinds of things. If you get really curious, then often what you discover is there's something that you can just change almost even a tiny bit. It's that orientation that brings your intention. I have this little graph in the book that's like intention and impact, and you're narrowing the gap. You're narrowing that angle between the two. And then all of your force and all of your energy sort of works together. Your intention and your impact are in alignment, and you have much more. You're not dividing your power. You've got much more force behind your energy, your leadership energy. So I guess the reason why I say your blind spot is your breakthrough is because I really do find that when we sit in that reflection of, okay, my intention is to this, but I'm obviously, like, people aren't doing, like, maybe my intention's to motivate them and people are not motivated. So then it's like, how do we get curious between those about that what's there?
Very, very. I mean, that just makes my mind speed ahead. But before we before I ask you another question, we'll take a
Yeah.
break. This is your host, Yvette Bethel, and we will be right back after this message. Organizational Soul is a mission-driven organization and network where we specialize in trust in academia, families, and organizations. We are building a community of leaders who are interested in trust and culture. If you are interested in our updates, you can sign up for our newsletter at orgsoul.com. As a thank you for joining our community, you can access our free resources that are designed to help you build your brand as a trusted leader as you contribute to safe space. Sign up now at orgsoul.com. Welcome back to Evolve. Our guest is coach, author, and speaker, Marisa Murray. Welcome back, Marissa. I would, I think we talked about false assumptions earlier, and now I'd like to talk about something that's connected, which has to do with core beliefs. We all have core beliefs that run on, automatic pilot. How do they perpetuate our blind spots? And what are some of the ones that you encounter more
Yeah,
often?
it's a great point. So one of the blind spots that I talk about in the book, one of the 7, is called outdated core beliefs. So we do speak specifically to outdated core beliefs. Core beliefs, of course, are always running in the background, and the ones that I think cause our blind spots that we want to focus on right now are the outdated ones, and we do need to upgrade them. But an example, just to tell you, one of the client stories. Core beliefs. Okay, so I guess what I would differentiate a false assumption between a core belief. False assumptions are usually things that maybe are a little bit more superficial. They're not like kind of wired in you, that you can easily change them. When you identify them, you can probably easily change them. You're like, oh, that was a false assumption, I'll just I just realize it's false, and now I move forward with this other assumption. Whereas core beliefs, and outdated core beliefs in particular, are often so unconscious that it's harder to change them, and sometimes harder to identify them. And once you identify them, there's some work to do to change them. But one of the examples in my book is Colin the competitor. So Colin just grew up in sports, always, just that energy around competition, 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 competition. And it was really the source of all the motivation for his work, etc. And it had gotten to a point where it was going to really limit his career, because at some point you can't be competing with your peers, you can't be competing with your boss, you can't be competing. It's no longer a competition. It's really it's no longer an individual performer competition. He was in individual performance sports too, not even team sports. But even people that come out of team sports, sometimes there's a difference between the collaboration required in an organization than in sports, because you're not the scoreboard is not as clear. Or it's more, or there's many scoreboards, right? Yeah. So there's just, and everybody has a piece to play for that. And so that outdated core belief of I need to win, I need to compete, that is something that's hard, because there's so many beautiful, exciting neurochemicals that come with that, right? You get dopamine with that, and you get all these energizing feelings. And so what in those cases we have to work, the breakthrough is to work to replace that sort of feeling of satisfaction and motivation with something that's as beautiful but different and doesn't get in the way of the collaborations.
Someone once asked me, they said, if it's a blind spot, how am I supposed to see it if the key word is blind?
I totally agree. And that's where that's where the definition of the difference between impact and intention was so helpful for me to explore, because you can't see it, but you can see there's a discrepancy. I actually use the example in the book of like how they find black holes. So they can't see a black hole, but they see matter disappearing into something. They see light particles disappearing. So they know there's a black hole because things are disappearing. And I think about blind spots a bit that way, whereas there's effectiveness that's being stripped away. That when you used to do this thing, it would have this direct reaction. And now you're doing that same thing, and it's not having that reaction. And so it's the evidence that surrounds it. And then you get curious about what's causing that.
What would you say to people? Because there are some people, they'll see the gap, but then they will assign the cause to some extrinsic variable. It may be because people are lazy or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. How can they see it? Because they'll see the gap and they're assigning it. And so covering the gap, in their mind, there's no gap because this is the explanation.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
How do we resolve that?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I talk about is it's really, and one of the ways I discovered most of the work that's represented in this book is by doing what I call stakeholder interviews, which are at the beginning of my coaching programs, I interview a number of people around this leader. And so a verbal 360, you might call it. But I try to basically get impact statements rather than feedback. And I know that's a really subtle difference, but I try during those to really ask questions around what impact are they having on you? And when they did that, what's the impact? And I'm trying to kind of understand, because feedback can be filled with a lot of advice and a lot of subjectivity, but impact is sort of, it's easier, I think, to be objective. And it's easier for the other person to understand, like this is the impact I'm having. And so if this is the impact I'm having across a number of different stakeholders, and so my job is to interview and get all these impact statements and then decide, what do I think are the consistently impact sort of differences that I feel as I've known, now I'm working with my client, I feel their intention. And I start to see that gap between what they're intending to do and the impact that they're having. And that's where we begin to explore it. And what I found amazing over the years is that there's an assumption in our minds that, the negative impact is on, people that we have weaker relationships with. And that is sometimes the case, but it's 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 rare that the people that we have great relationships don't see that impact too. They see it as well. It just doesn't bother them as much because they love you, and they know that, they know that the good outweighs the bad. And so their tolerance level for what is maybe an imperfect way of being is much higher. And so what I'm looking for in these impact statements is I'm really looking for what is everyone saying, because basically that is where the blind spot is. And when I manage to do that, where I can really show and I can really work with the coachee to sort of see that everybody sees this and this is going to elevate the quality of every relationship, then it's not as easy for their brain to basically just throw the information out.
Powerful. I think there are some blind spots that are more nuanced. They aren't as obvious, like within that gap.
Yeah.
How do you help your clients with the ones that are less obvious?
Yeah. Well, the one that I think is one of the ones that's less obvious, although there's probably others, is triggers from past pain. So one of them is triggers from past pain. And that one is less obvious because it's very personal. And we don't always know that we're being triggered by past pain, right? We just know we're irritated or our behavior shifts. And so that's an example of when the behavior, it just feels elevated or out of line or sort of out of the blue. And with those ones, it takes a little bit, it takes more time to sort of to allow or help the client unpeel, like, where is that, what was that trigger, and how is that trigger no longer relevant in this circumstance. One of the ones that one of the case studies that I talk about is Paul the Protector, and he had this career where he would, really accelerate very quickly, and then after 5 years or so, he would typically be fired. He sort of had like a few of these, and he would be fired mostly because there'd be, some contingent issues that he was trying to protect the firm from. In these cases, he was a lawyer, and he would kind of become at odds with his leadership. So there's these, but it was a pattern. And so when I started working with him, he was at like 4 years with his firm, and I didn't know this history, right? But I knew that he was getting, the feedback that I was receiving was that he was getting agitated. He was getting more aggressive. He was getting less collaborative. And so it was really interesting to kind of unpack. And so it took a while in our coaching program for him to reveal this pattern, and for him to reveal that he was actually, what was happening was he was seeing these contentious issues, and he was aware of the fact that, when he took a firm stand in the past, that he had been fired, and he was just really confused about how he was going to navigate these particular issues. And he was really worried about getting fired. But this was all very, 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 very hidden. Even in many ways, the mind is just phenomenal in terms of the stuff it's holding on to back there to protect us, right? And yet it creates all kinds of dis-ease in our ability to collaborate. So we worked together on improving the quality of the way in which he was able to handle these issues, like to be less contentious, but also trying to basically teach his brain to break this pattern. This pattern does not need to continue to repeat, and that the past pain was triggering behaviors that was going to actually make it repeat. So it's really powerful.
Put himself in a loop.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a final question, if you'd like our audience to remember one thing about this conversation, what would it be?
Well, I think your blind spot is your breakthrough is really, I really am so compassionate for my clients. This is a courageous journey looking for your blind spots. I mean, the job of a leader is hard enough, let alone peeling yourself apart on a regular basis, trying to sort of renew all your skill sets and capabilities, and be intentional about that. And so there, I just want people to remember that there's ease on the other side of this. It's not, feedback and impact statements and coaching and working on yourself. There's such a beautiful payoff when you can get to that breakthrough. And yeah, it does take some introspection and it does take some vulnerability. But every story, there's 21 client stories in the book, and they're all incredibly insightful, and it's always, there's a payoff with every single one of them.
I'd like to thank you, Marissa, for such an engaging interview. I really enjoyed it. Your insights will certainly support our audience with building the skills they need to kind of figure out that middle that space between impact and intent.
Yeah.
And before we sign off, can you please share with our audience how they can connect with you?
Yeah, so my website is leaderly.com. So it's L-E-Y, leader, L-E-Y.com. You can see it actually if you're watching the video behind me. And that's the best way to reach out to me. Or if you are hanging out on LinkedIn, please connect. And then my books are all on Amazon.
We would like to thank you for taking the time to join us on Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures.
Thank you for listening to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures. Learn more about our proprietary trust, leadership, and culture courses and certifications at the IFB Academy. You can check them out at organizationalsoul.learnworlds.com.